So welcome everyone. We're pleased to have you with us this evening. I'm Trinity Lescalette, the Adult Programming Manager at the Tiffin Seneca Public Library in Tiffin, Ohio. Tonight's event is co-hosted by the library and the Heidelberg University English Department with the support of Brooks and Jean Warren Geckler. Their generosity with the Heidelberg English Department has made this series possible, and I believe that Jean is with us in the audience tonight. I think I saw her name pop up, so welcome. Thank you for making this possible. Our special guest tonight is Professor Garry Leonard from the University of Toronto. But before I officially introduce him and turn things over to him, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Barry Devine. Dr. Devine is an assistant professor of English at Heidelberg University, and he has been teaching at Heidelberg for 4 years. He is a specialist in the works of James Joyce and Irish Modernism, and is a contributor to the forthcoming The Cambridge Centenary Ulysses. His general research interests focus on the manuscripts, notebooks, and letters of modernist authors. Dr. Devine is currently researching James Joyce's revisions to Ulysses during the final 6 months before publication in February 1922. And as I was looking over this earlier, I realized 2022 will be the 100th anniversary. We might have to plan something special. Last fall, Dr. Devine reached out to me about partnering to present a lecture series on Tiffin native John Quinn. So Dr. Devine, please tell us a little bit about John Quinn and his work with T.S. Eliot.
Yes, thank you, Trinity, and welcome to everyone joining us tonight or this morning, depending on where you are. I know people got visiting from India, where it's just after 4 a.m. and in China, where it's just after 6:30 a.m. So I really appreciate you getting up so early. And welcome back to everyone who joined us for the first John Quinn lecture on James Joyce and his short stories in Dubliners. And I believe Ellen Scheibel, who was our guest speaker that day, will be joining us today if she hasn't already. So I want to talk a little bit about John Quinn and why this lecture series is named after him. And then I'll get into his relationship with T.S. Eliot and his work getting the Wasteland published. So as a James Joyce scholar, I learned about John Quinn long before moving to Heidelberg University in this very small town of Tiffin, Ohio, which I later found out to my great surprise is where Quinn was born. His father was a baker here in town, and his family shortly after that moved to a town called Fostoria, just 15 miles from here. And I knew that Quinn bought Joyce's handwritten manuscripts for Ulysses, and I knew that he defended Joyce and his American publishers in a New York obscenity case, a case which he lost. But things got better. Joyce was able to finally publish Ulysses, but it took another decade before it was published in the US. I later learned that Quinn worked with many other modernist writers and artists. He was very close with the entire Yeats family. He secured publishing contracts for W.B. Yeats. He purchased many original works of art from John Butler Yeats, the father of the poet, and from Jack Yeats, his brother. And he remained a great friend of the Yeats family for the rest of his life. Quinn also worked extensively with Ezra Pound and contributed either financially or performed legal work or both for many other modernist writers. Quinn also collected modern art at a time when it wasn't very popular in the United States. He seemed to understand the value of the art being produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe, and so he bought as much of it as he could. By the time of his untimely death of intestinal cancer at the age of 54, Quinn had amassed the largest collection of modern art in the world. He had over 200 works of painting and sculpture and drawings from 151 artists, including over 50 pieces from Picasso, works by Matisse, Gauguin, Seurat, Duchamp, and many, many others. I'm currently planning our next lecture in October about Quinn's art collection, in particular his Picassos. So watch for future announcements about that event. But the focus today is on T.S. Eliot and his masterpiece, The Wasteland. So let me share my screen with you guys. I got a slideshow. All right. There we go. So John Quinn was first introduced to T.S. Eliot in writing by Ezra Pound. And Pound acted as kind of an intermediary between them until they got to know each other. Quinn and Eliot soon began exchanging letters without Pound as chaperone and quickly developed great mutual respect for one another. Quinn got to know Eliot as a quiet and reserved person of great humility and talent, and Quinn wanted to help support his art by acting as a benefactor. But Eliot was reluctant to accept any money from Quinn as an advance on his writing or just to help support him, unlike other writers like James Joyce, who would take money from anybody who had it and offered it up. Eliot was also deeply uncomfortable that Quinn and Pound were doing a lot of pro bono work behind the scenes to get Eliot's poems published in the US. This meant that Pound and Quinn had to work in secrecy for fear that Eliot would tell them to stop, which he probably would have. Quinn offered to cover all of the costs for the publication of Eliot's first collection of poems, entitled Proof Rock and Other Observations, even though Quinn hated the title. He hated the name Proof Rock and kept trying to convince Eliot to change it. But Ezra Pound kindly refused Quinn's generosity, wanting to be the one who launched the career of this young, talented poet. Pound's publication was a limited run, and so Quinn took it upon himself to approach a publisher with the ability to print on a much larger scale. And he brought Eliot's poems personally to Alfred Knopf. And while Knopf liked Eliot's poems very much, he was unwilling to incur the costs for such a small collection from a relatively unknown poet. But Quinn persuaded Knopf to agree to printing a larger collection once Eliot had more to show. And so they had to wait. As they waited, Quinn and Pound had tried desperately to get Eliot out of his full-time job at Lloyd's Bank in London. They knew he could write much more poetry if he was not burdened with a very demanding work schedule. Quinn wrote many letters on Eliot's behalf, trying to find him a position more suitable to a writer, but he did not succeed in finding Eliot a job outside the bank. In 1919, Eliot was getting desperate for a book deal. He was not only hampered by his bank job, he was now getting pressure from his family in America to find a new career. He wanted to have something to show his family to prove that he could be a successful writer and a successful poet. He wrote to Quinn pleading for his help to get Knopf to publish his work and to finally get his work out from a major publisher. He wrote to Quinn apologizing for all the work that he was doing. He wrote, "My only justification is that I do not know anyone else with either the influence, the intelligence, or the generosity necessary to undertake it. It's quite obvious that without you, I should never get anything published in America at all." And Quinn began to put tremendous pressure on Knopf and eventually made the publication arrangements. And he successfully changed the title that he hated so much. And in 1920, Knopf published the collection called Poems by T.S. Eliot, containing 24 of Eliot's poems, including Proof Rock, Gerontion, and the Preludes. Eliot's poems were finally in print from a major publishing house. In his letter thanking Quinn profusely for his efforts, Eliot wrote, "If you took no further interest in my affairs, whatever, you would still have earned my lifelong gratitude, which I assure you you shall have." And he ended this same letter with a hint at his next poetic undertaking. He says, "I hope to get started on a poem I have in mind." This was Eliot's first veiled reference to what would become the Wasteland. While Eliot was hard at work on this new poem, Quinn began to commit Eliot's older poems to memory. He would frequently recite them in public and praise Eliot's talents to whoever would listen. So this is dedication to a client when you're memorizing their poems. In 1921, Eliot sent Pound a draft of The Wasteland. And Pound was stunned at his genius. And I love this first page of the manuscript for a lot of reasons. We see the original title of the poem. It was called "He Do the Police in Different Voices," which is a line from Dickens' Our Mutual Friend. And you'll also notice, if you're reading some of these lines now, that none of these lines actually appear in the final poem. Eliot scratched out and eliminated this entire first page. Pound, after reading this and being stunned, immediately devised a scheme to finally get Eliot out of his bank job so he could write full time. Pound sought out 30 people to donate £10 a year, which would guarantee Eliot a suitable income. Quinn immediately agreed to buy 7 of these shares himself. But before the funds could be collected and reach him in England, Eliot suffered an anxiety attack and had to take a leave of absence from the bank and recover at a sanitarium in Switzerland. I think we'd all like to recover at a sanitarium in Switzerland. It was here that he completed the manuscript for the Wasteland. Eliot sent Quinn at least 2 drafts of the completed poem, including the copy with revisions and notes suggested by Pound. Quinn had them typed up and delivered to the publishing house of Bonai and Liveright, despite the fact that Quinn despised Horace Liveright for being difficult to work with and for producing books of inferior quality. Bonai and Liveright started the Modern Library series, and Quinn was not a fan of their quality at the time. Alfred Knopf, who Quinn could boss around a little bit more freely, had already filled his production schedule for the year, and so he was unavailable. During all of the drafts and negotiations for publishing The Wasteland, Quinn repeatedly referred to it as the poems, plural, despite Eliot's constant references to it in the singular. Quinn never quite understood that The Wasteland was one poem divided into 5 sections. Despite this embarrassing misunderstanding, Eliot was so grateful for Quinn's work in securing a fair contract with Bonai and Liveright that he offered to send Quinn the final manuscript draft as a gift, since Quinn was well known for collecting manuscripts. The exchange that followed was typical of the deep mutual respect and admiration between the two. Quinn said that he could not take it as a gift, but he would happily pay Eliot for the manuscript. Eliot did not feel right about this arrangement, given that Quinn had done so much for him in secrecy and free of charge, and he insisted that Quinn accept it as a gift. Quinn countered that he would accept the manuscript of The Wasteland as a gift, as a mark of their friendship, if Eliot agreed to sell him the manuscripts of his older poems. Their polite negotiations were finally settled, and Eliot agreed to the gift of The Wasteland and the sale of his other collected manuscripts. But Eliot had a condition. The manuscripts must be valued at its actual market value and not at any value which it may or may not acquire in the course of time. Eliot didn't want Quinn inflating the value based on what it might be worth later. And Quinn finally settled on a fair price of about £30, which in today's money is about $2,500. Things were proceeding smoothly with the Liveright publication of the poem, so Quinn took a vacation for a month. I think we all know what happens when things are going well and we leave for a month. Quinn returned to confusion and chaos. Eliot wanted his brand new Criterion magazine to publish The Wasteland in England 2 months ahead of the Bonai and Liveright edition. And the Dial American magazine approached Eliot and asked him to publish the poem 1 month in advance of the Bonai and Liveright book. Liveright, of course, was furious, and everyone was pointing fingers at one another. Quinn called both American editors into his office and negotiated a deal representing the interests of Eliot's Criterion magazine himself. The final details were settled that day in Quinn's office. The Dial would publish the poem without notes in November of 1922. They would pay Eliot the standard rate and announce that Bonai and Liveright would be publishing the volume with notes a month later. The notes are important. I'm sure you guys know if you've tried to read this poem already. Quinn got them all both to agree that Eliot could publish the Criterion edition a month ahead of the Dial, but with the understanding that no copies were to be sent to anyone in America, including current subscribers. This scheme met with great success in the sales of all 3 editions. B.L. Reid, the author of Quinn's biography, commented that probably no poem of comparable length was ever more promptly, more variously, or more copiously rewarded. And I think that probably still stands today. Despite his persistent misunderstanding of the structure and meaning of the poem, Quinn also memorized this poem. He memorized the entire text, as he did with Eliot's other poems, and he recited the entire Wasteland verbatim on more than one occasion. Over the next year, Quinn continued to execute Pound's scheme to try to raise donations so that Eliot could quit his job at the bank. But Quinn, whose intestinal cancer had returned, became sicker and sicker and died just 18 months after The Wasteland was published. His funeral was held in New York City, His two living sisters, along with a small group of his close friends, accompanied the body on the train where he was buried in his family plot in Fostoria, Ohio. That's just 15 miles from where he was born, or about 15 miles from where I'm sitting right now. Stop sharing. So that is how we got this masterpiece of modernist literature into our hands. For those of you interested in seeing Quinn's manuscripts of Pound's edits, Eliot's second wife, Valerie, published this really beautiful volume here, which you can see. It's called The Wasteland, a Facsimile and Transcript of the Original Drafts. And you can see that she's got the original document published, and over here she's got transcriptions with Eliot's changes in red. And this is really a beautiful edition if you want to see how this poem came together and how much work Ezra Pound actually put into it. I can post the ISBN for this book. It's still in publication, still on sale at bookstores. But that's all I've got. I'll now turn things back over to Trinity so we can introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you. And I would like to introduce, oops, let me spotlight the correct person. I'd like to introduce this evening's guest speaker. Dr. Garry Leonard is a professor of literature and film at the University of Toronto. He is the author of 2 books on James Joyce, Reading Dubliners Again, A Lacanian Perspective, and Advertising and Commodity Culture in Joyce. More recently, Film International published his essay, What Grows in This Stony Rubble? Melodrama in It's a Wonderful Life and the Wasteland. So we want to thank you for being here this evening, Dr. Leonard. If you have questions or comments, feel free to add them into the chat, and then he can come back to those when we get to that portion of this evening. So I will turn things over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm probably going to go for 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. And of course, once that's the framework, the question becomes, what approach do I take that will be reward your attention the most in 40 minutes? So you'll find me talking about strategies of reading The Wasteland. I'm going to try and avoid getting into the weeds, if you will, of the numerous allusions that there are. Eliot himself tried to explain the allusions, but he kind of turned The Wasteland from a modern poem almost into a postmodern poem when he added his own notes to his own poem, and then added this meta level where the notes began to be analyzed with the same acuity as the poem itself, and so every single thing he said was also became an echo chamber. So it was like, you know, something worthy of a short story by Borges. But anyway, so what I want to do is talk about why is it written this way? Why did Eliot write it the way he did? Why did Pound do what he then did? And why was Eliot not only amazingly accepting of Pound's changes? There's not a lot of record of, you know, debates and certainly not acrimony. And then he dedicates the poem to Pound, calling him the better craftsman. So it's a remarkable exchange. You know, Eliot writes something like the first draft. Pound slashes and burns in a manner that can't possibly be explicated, really. And Eliot says, thanks. This is better crafted. Although I do think that the use of the word is probably important. That he calls Pound the better craftsman. He doesn't call Pound the better poet. And so I do think he's conceding a certain structural capacity. But what is that structural capacity? Why didn't Eliot do it himself if he liked it so much when Pound did it? So what was there? What did Eliot see in what Pound did? And we have to remember that Pound didn't add things. He certainly didn't write his own words. All he did was cut. He left things out, and often in significant chunks. So mostly in significant chunks. So it wasn't a question of tweaking this word or that word. So you'll find me describing Pound at a certain point as approaching, as an editor, approaching the Wasteland much more like a film editor than a traditional literary editor. Pound seemed to be cutting the way a film director might cut. Not so much about content, not saying that this line isn't good or this line, it would seem have very little to do with content. It had something to do with creating jarring effect. This is part of my argument. So that one of the most notorious and frequent complaints of the Wasteland, of where's the continuity, both Eliot and then Pound worked really hard to introduce discontinuity. So this isn't, I mean, you can still critique that if you want, but it's hardly a failing on their part. Without Pound, I think Eliot wanted the Wasteland. He expected it to be jarring and discontinuous, but he put in too many segues. And part of what Pound seemed to do was cut out segues. And when you look at, now that we have them, when you look at many of the things that Pound cut out, they quote unquote help a little in the sense that they seem to give more context. But you get that uneasy feeling that well, Eliot's probably right. The poem's better without it. Certainly nobody suggested that they go back in. So this is going to lead to one of the ways I suggest reading The Wasteland, and that is to try and resist the very natural urge to introduce continuity, or to wonder, or to perceive it as a failing on your part. And it's something I tell my students, especially my undergraduates, don't just leap to the conclusion that you're failing to understand the poem, because failing to understand the poem is built into the way the poem is written. You're supposed to fail to understand it. I think you're supposed to try to understand it. It's kind of a trick in a way, because you're invited to understand it, you're encouraged to understand it, but it's written in a way that you can't. And it does open up this really a bit of a modernist question, like, well, if the point of reading a poem is not to understand it, or if that goal is both invited and then persistently made impossible, what's the point of reading it? And B, if there is a point, what is it? And so this is why I say that my lecture is a bit about reading style, because you have to let the Wasteland happen to you. You can't happen to the Wasteland. And as I joke with my undergraduates, if you read The Wasteland or any poem and think you understand it, you haven't read it carefully enough. The point of this poem is to catch you out with your own bridgings. And I think this even extends into the notes, which are also somewhat designed to mislead a little bit. They offer you hope by saying Tiresias is the center of the poem and everyone is so excited, but they can't quite make that work. And of course his allusions to the golden bough, everyone goes out and devours the golden bough, but it doesn't necessarily help any more than devouring Homer's Odyssey gives you the key to Joyce's Ulysses. One of the other modernist received ideas, and this comes from Eliot primarily in his review of James Joyce's Ulysses, is that one of the major crises of modernity, especially after World War I, is that no one knows how to represent anything anymore. There's a manner in which World War I could be said to have blown up realism. Realism and rationality seemed to have brought World War I onto the stage. And the Dadaists and the Surrealists were among the first to say art has to embrace quote unquote nonsense, because logic brought World War I. And the World War was kind of insane. So rationality was seen as a dark lord in a way that had just unleashed this unimaginable carnage on multiple nations and on millions of primarily young men. So modernists who weren't necessarily referring to themselves as modernists began to tax themselves with the necessity to not be logical. As the Talking Heads will have their album Stop Making Sense many years later. But I think the modernists were already assigning themselves that label, stop making sense, which isn't quite the same as nonsense, but it's to argue that there was something about sense that that would exclude alternatives. And so part of the beauty of not being able to, quote unquote, understand the wasteland is that the wasteland exists as a kind of continually shimmering possibility. Because the price you pay for certitude is the diminishment of possibility. Certitude can be gratifying, but certitude has a way of earning its clarity by eliminating the ability to imagine alternatives. I'm not convinced entirely there's any such thing as certitude. There's only successful strategies of limiting alternative ways of thinking, which might also be a way to describe religion. And Eliot seems extremely aware of this, which is why I think there are so many discourses in the wasteland, most notoriously perhaps popular culture. In general, Joyce is seen as the one who embraced popular culture with all of its naughtiness and vulgarity intact, and that Eliot, if he introduced popular culture holding his nose, that he had to do it because he was so offended by it. But I'd like to challenge that in this talk too, not least of all because he wrote a very moving eulogy of Marie Lloyd, who had been a singer in the British music hall scene, for a legend for years. And he essentially wrote a eulogy about her, which was partly a denunciation of the gramophone, which might not come as a shock when you see how the gramophone gets featured, particularly with the typist who casually puts on a record after her rather pointless tryst with an impossibly self-enchanted store clerk. So he thought, he loved the music hall because it was live, and gramophone was very new and records were very new, and but it wasn't the songs that he had a problem with, or even the vulgarity of the songs. It was the disembodied prepackaging that vinyl, wax, I suppose at that point, records permitted, and the lack of context for the presentation. So let me go to a few remarks that I wrote out now, because I like to read a little bit when I have such a short amount of time to communicate. So the most important line in the poem for my comments today, and then if you talk to me tomorrow, it'd be a different line. So for today, the human engine waits like a taxi throbbing, waiting. So Eliot does a trick he does often in his poetry, where the last word, waiting, could apply just as much to a heart that is waiting as to a taxi that is waiting. And there's a circularity here that makes this a very resonant and evocative image. How is the human heart like a taxi waiting? How is a taxi waiting like a human heart? And it can sort of work both ways, and it's kind of a Mobius strip. And I'm going to be talking about the modern self, the experience of modernity, and how to present that in art. Because the paradox of modernism is that it's trying to represent a crisis of representation. How do you represent a crisis of representation? Because when you start representing it, aren't you falsifying somehow? So the difficulty of interpreting so much modernist works and art, Picasso comes to mind, is they have to invent a new method of representing. They have to invent a method of representing that illustrates the crisis of representation. Things that we used to think were mimetic, were imitations, were in fact also had their own strategies. They also limited alternatives. So much, you're going to hear me using the word explosion a lot in the talk that follows. Arguably, Picasso almost literally, not just in Guernica, explodes the canvas. So you have multiple perspectives on a single face. You have a complete violation of depth of field in all of the post-impressionists. where you no longer have this illusion of seeing into the painting. And Picasso will in fact put bits of, cane, the bottom of a chair to make the canvas call attention to how flat the canvas is. And cinema at this time was involved in this same debate because cinema was a new form of representation. And initially, no one really thought of it that way. They thought of it as a scientific instrument. Cinema recorded light. So it was used by Muybridge to do motion studies and things like that. And then it had a novelty value, entertainment value as part of the music hall, as part of country fairs. People were intrigued to see, for instance, a train entering the station. These movies were 30, 40, 50 seconds long, but everybody assumed, including the Lumiere brothers who invented cinema, that it was a novelty and they'd better make their money and get out because people are going to get bored. No one could see what film could become. And but film had that same weird illusion that if you're D.W. Griffith, the American director, then you cut up movies to give the illusion of continuity. And if you're Salvador Dali in a movie like Un Chien Andalou, then you cut up movies to draw attention to how cut up the movie is. So, and I think that's another way to think about Eliot and Pound's relationship. Is they want to, if we think of, and this is not the only way I want you to think about it, but for the sake of argument, we compare The Wasteland to a movie, especially in the way that it was edited. Then we have the deliberate introduction of meta discontinuity that calls attention to itself as discontinuous to expose the many myths we have to generate an illusion of continuity. Something along the lines of what Althusser will call ideology, which he defined as your imagined relationship to your actual existence. It's very hard to, in The Wasteland, we see characters who are deeply involved in their own ideology. They have an imaginary relationship to their actual selves, whether it's the women talking in the pub or the tarot card reader. Any of the characters who show up in The Wasteland are presented as having no real anxiety at all about how they view themselves in the world. But because the poem itself refuses to have continuity, it tends to highlight how discontinuous our myths of continuity are. So one of the ways we understand the modern self is as an engine of acquisition, an engine of forward motion. One of the ways to think about the experience of modernity is that it's a series of explosive moments, this is Walter Benjamin's point, that we have to contain. So I'm going to read you a quote from, of all people, Gertrude Stein, where she, in her inimitable way, highlights the internal combustion engine as the most important part of modern art. And she says the following: one can very well measure the authenticity and power of a work by its truth to its time. There are other measures, but the truth to its time is most easily seen by comparing or confusing it with the typical real created product of the time. In our case, the internal combustion engine, surely. And sooner or later, criticism will need to get used to thinking in terms of forces, tensions, movements, and speeds. So I think Stein is giving us an insight into how criticism is going to have to shift if it's going to keep pace with what modern artists are already trying to do. They're not building logical structures anymore. They are presenting force, pressure, breakdown, fracture, rupture, and also attempts at continuity. But more and more, not unlike an internal combustion engine, which is basically the containment of explosions in order to convert them into forward motion. That's what I hate to tell you if you have to drive home, but that's what a car is. You are riding a bomb that is inside a steel case. And were it not inside a steel case, you couldn't go anywhere. So what I'm proposing, and yet another general way to think of the Wasteland, is what Pound does is he takes away the steel casing of the engine of the Wasteland until it's a series of explosions, which is what a car is, but they're not contained and they're not converted into the myths of progress that modernity thrives on, that everything is somehow forward motion. What if everything is random explosions contained in an explosion chamber and converted into the appearance of progress? I mean, does a car really drive down the road, or is that a controlled explosion? At both. And I think that's the dynamic of the Wasteland. And as a critic, and I do this all the time, we are invited to build containment strategies for the Wasteland. But it seems to me we can miss the full genius of Eliot drawing attention to how modernity is a series of shocks, and that our containment strategies for it, however necessary, are always illusions. And they will correspondingly, once we commit to them as a pattern, the positive result is we'll be capable of forward motion. We'll go to school, we'll get a job, we'll achieve and we'll accomplish. But there's also depression and anxiety and breakdown lurking around the edge of any strategy that seeks to contain explosion and convert it into forward motion. And right there in that line that I'm about the taxis, Eliot's specific. I mean, cars break down. Why do we use the term nervous breakdown? There could be other terms, but we seem, without even thinking a whole lot about it, we do seem to correlate mental health crises as mechanical breakdowns. And Freud himself made that almost inevitable, because his entire theory about the id and the ego and the superego was inspired by the invention of the hydraulic press. At the time that Freud was fashioning his ideas in Vienna, the degree to which you could convert the hydraulic pressure into force had come in as a further advance on the internal combustion engine. So when Joyce talks about repression, he's kind of giving the affective equivalent of what happens when you use hydraulic pressure. Like, we need repression to move things, but what happens when the hydraulic pressure ruptures? Then all the force is gone, and this becomes one of the cornerstones of psychoanalysis. So Gertrude Stein, with her particular trick of always hiding in plain sight, puts the internal combustion engine front and center, offering it as exhibit A, that modernity is not just about new and explosive energy, but also about ingenious systems of containment and control intended to convert random explosions into calibrated forward movement. If the internal combustion engine is the manufactured equivalent of this tension, then development of cinematic narrative is the visual equivalent, what Benjamin in fact says of cinema, the dynamite of a tenth of a second, which then becomes, in the hands of the Russian director Sergei Eisenstein, the technique of montage, where two images are set, each toward the other, on a collision course, with the ensuing wreckage, a third creation, neither present nor predictable in the first two, and yet telegraphed to the mind of the viewer, nowhere, strictly speaking, visible. Such a collision, and I'm going to argue that there's a way in which the clashes, the uncontainable explosions in the Wasteland, generate an effect in the reader that you can't specifically find on the page. And that as readers, we need to be open to that. And this is, I don't have a problem with tracking down Eliot's illusions, but it can blind us to, there's a reason that there's hundreds of allusions to thousands of years of Western culture. And it's not just that we go on an Easter egg hunt. It's precisely to put Western culture into this almost atomic energy fission relationship with itself. And Tiresias can simultaneously be in a bedroom somewhere in London and a 2,000-year-old prophet at the same time. So for ingenious strategies of containment, we have to turn to the American director Griffith and his constitution of narrative cinema based on seamless editing that gives the illusion of continuity. But isn't this what the internal combustion engine does? Our smooth drive down the highway is also, and at the same time, a series of rapid and continual explosions inside the metal casing. One way to view the compulsive, convulsive, explosive experience of reading The Wasteland is to imagine it as the series of explosions that power the self, or the use of montage to drive forward the cinematic, but without the metal casing, without the containment strategy. As you know, Pound deleted in total nearly a third of the poem. His deletions were unilateral and not the result of consultation, so much so that Eliot dedicated the poem, The Better Craftsman. It's difficult to see a consistent pattern for why Pound excised one line and yet not another. Pound did not seem to think an explanation was necessary. There is no case to be made for the deletions on a line-by-line basis, I would argue, because the common denominator of their sum total is an overall effect on the reader with no concern for narrative coherency, which really wasn't Eliot's concern either, and even less so Pound's. So Pound, working much more like a film editor than a literary editor, deleted material that suggested segues in order to make the whole poem a series of what directors would call jump cuts, as opposed to seamless editing. Famous jump cut would be Kubrick cutting from the ape throwing a bone to a spaceship circling a planet. So in a single cut, Kubrick elides 4 million years. That's the effect of jump cuts, is they eliminate space and time as continuous. So the tension between modernism and modernity is the tension between the steel casing of the engine and the explosions it contains. In The Wasteland, in what amounts to the aesthetic equivalent of trauma, the metal casing is gone. A throbbing taxi waiting, a throbbing human heart, all one and the same. The resulting nakedness and shattering vulnerability is nearly unbearable to witness. But it is witnessing that Eliot wants from us, not watching, not looking, not observing, and certainly not tabulating, just witnessing, the act that is most conducive to a healing process to a victim of trauma. Eliot has begun what Beckett will declare the prime directive of the modernist artist going forward, quote, to present the chaos for what it is and not pretend it's something else. Because the poem itself eschews all containment strategies, the compartmentalizing of the characters in the poem become that much more stark and obvious. We see without being told the construction of the necessary fictions encasing a comprehensible version of the otherwise volatile and explosive modern self, and the internal combustion engine, one and the same. The self as a metal casing built around the explosive caused by the mixing, to quote Eliot, of memory and desire. And I've always been fascinated by that, by the word choice there, the mixing of memory and desire, making it almost sound like a fuel. He doesn't say memory and desire, but what happens when you mix memory and desire? It's a lot like Eisenstein's third term. Presumably when you mix memory and desire, you get this third thing, but he doesn't say what it is. And I think in some ways in reading The Wasteland, it mixes our memory and desire. Because one of the things that's so haunting about The Wasteland to me when I read it is, and the closest thing to a consistent principle, if I can say that in the poem, is this sense of remembering the time you turned away from what you now spend all of your time mourning the loss of. It begins with the Hyacinth Girl, for instance. And that's a very, and it happens repeatedly throughout the poem. The memory of a moment where you turned away from something that you now cannot stop regretting, but that's in a way that's, you knew that at the time that you turned away from it, but you couldn't stop yourself. And this seems to be one of the laments of the poem, is that if you subscribe to your patterns of understanding the world too deeply, you will miss the world. And if your life makes too much sense, it doesn't make any sense. Because by the time we get to the end of your life, he talks about how the awful daring of a moment's surrender is what he calls it, which a life of prudence cannot undo. A lifetime of prudence cannot undo. And it seems that at every point in this poem, when there was a call for the awful daring of a moment's surrender, the call was declined, and then it sets up this permanent regret. And it's something, we mentioned Barry in his very concise and useful summary of how the Wasteland was coming into existence. There is this other presumption about Eliot that the problems of being a banker, the difficulties of his first marriage, which are all been thoroughly cataloged, these were all impeding him. But I think he knew this, much as he hated those. He knew that these impediments were his art. It's never been terribly clear why he, almost on impulse, entered into the first marriage with a woman he barely knew, and it almost immediately didn't work. And he did say cryptically once, she almost destroyed me as a man, but she helped make me a poet. So there's a curious, I don't think Eliot would have benefited from a much smoother life as a poet, although he might have had an easier time of it. So in here we might briefly recall the Futurist Manifesto by the Italian Marinetti, which details in highly impressionistic form a car being run into a ditch and rolling over. The sound of its engine, Marinetti describes as, quote, a famished roar. So again, you get that uncased engine in the 1909 Futurist Manifesto, which was published on the front page of Le Monde and became yet another, along with the Surrealist Manifesto, a really important call to arms, if you will, to modernist artists. And again, the Dadaist Manifesto declares that if anything is to be considered art, quote, every page should explode. So, nothing about containing that explosion. And it almost seems as if one of the importances, how do you represent a crisis of representation? You refuse encasements, you refuse structurings, you present the chaos for what it is. You don't pretend it's something else. The internal combustion engine is a machine that requires explosion and repetitive rupture in order to produce smooth, continuous forward motion. As such, it is an apt metaphor for modernity, where a continual renewed series of shocks is systematically converted into, quote, progress. One does not normally look at the sleek outlines of a Porsche or a Ferrari and think about explosions and ruptures, because surrounding the internal engine are mufflers, shock absorbers, other buffers, continuing out to the design of the body itself with its visual emphasis on unimpeded speed and unfettered motion. There is a contradiction, in other words, between the elegant exterior and the controlled bomb it surrounds, and without which it would have no function. What's the point of a Porsche without an engine, no matter how beautiful it is? And it would make a mockery of all those wonderfully sleek lines that suggest speed. It's not going anywhere. That's the aestheticization of shock when you look at the design of a Porsche. So in contesting ways to define, delimit, and legitimate various directions in modernist studies, as Friedman says, a modernist scholar, we become caught in a repetition of the unresolved contradictions. And I think this is an important comment on her part, that not only for what it states, but for what I think it implies, which is we who seek to define modernist studies also seek to resolve unresolved contradictions. And sometimes that's seen what modernist studies is, but why? What if modernist studies should be leaving them unresolved and studying the unresolvability of them? Why this drive for their resolution? Why not take Stein's advice and get used to thinking in terms of forces, tensions, moments, tractions, speeds, the tensions set up between tarot cards, the movement of people trudging home from work across London Bridge, causing the narrator of the moment to remark, I had not realized death had undone so many, a remark originally made by Dante's narrator upon witnessing in hell the vast array of all people who had ever died since the beginning of time. Curiously, in the same year he wrote The Wasteland, Eliot lavished praise on Joyce for inventing what Eliot called the mythic method in Ulysses, containing the meanderings of Bloom, a cuckolded Irish-Jewish advertising canvasser within the epic structure of Homer's The Odyssey. Eliot declared what Joyce had done had, quote, the importance of a scientific discovery. like, say, the internal combustion engine. But Eliot's discovery of Joyce's mythic method is not really, it's not Joyce's discovery. It's Eliot's imposition of it's nothing Joyce ever claimed. It says more about Eliot's anxieties than Joyce's accomplishments. Who among us would want to argue that Ulysses is somehow contained? Not to mention Finnegan's Wake, which employs no containment strategy whatsoever and operates more along the lines of a Big Bang theory, detonating from the point of the first word and hurtling through a universe it forms even as it explodes from that point onward. Man loves to create roads, says Dostoevsky, and I'm actually moving to something like a conclusion, believe it or not. That is beyond dispute, but may it not be that man is instinctively afraid of attaining his goal, a built road, end quote. Even Eliot attempted to pave the wasteland with his application of notes to various allusions, and critics have followed his lead for decades, but why? The glory is in the imagining of paving it, but not the actuality. The poem endures all the attempts to pave it over the same way nature does. No sooner is the way made smooth than cracks become possible. And I think the wasteland is about the cracks. It's not, it acknowledges the paving, but the point is not to repair the road of the wasteland, not to try and repair the cracks that Pound just sledgehammered this poem. And then I think Eliot just looked at the shattering and said, and admired the shattering, maybe not in detail, because he just accepted it all and said, you're a better craftsman. I think he loved the fact that Pound somehow whacked this poem in such a way that there's no way you're going to uncrack it. There's no way that it's not going to be cracked, no matter how you pave it. So April is the cruelest month. Winter freezes, spring cracks. The cracks show the pain you can pave, but not eliminate. Whatever grows also hurts. But worse than that is wasteland. Like a good horticulturalist, Eliot wants, before cursing a lack of growth, that we take a look at the soil. What are the roots that clutch? One of the early narrators says. What grows in this stony rubble? In other words, why are you complaining about the desolate, the fact that it's a wasteland? The problem here is not that nothing is growing, but that nothing can grow. That's a more fundamental problem. And to simply lament that things aren't growing without getting down to why, that's the problem of the Fisher King that we finally see at the end. He's sitting on the bank and he can't figure out what to do. He's an image of modern depression. Things won't grow. He doesn't know why, and he somehow can't around on the problem to try and figure out why is his state of being so arid? Why is nothing growing in him? It's not that things can't grow. It's there's something about his soil, and this gets back to what I was saying earlier, that we have to be careful when discourses define for us what our soil should be, because if they're wrong, and they frequently are, and we don't think about, is this the right soil for me to grow? And all we think about is, why can't I grow? You're setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up for the entire array of modern mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, everything else, because you're trying to grow in stony rubble, having been convinced that it's nurturing soil. But I don't want to wish. So I don't want to wish I don't want to wish to claim that the wasteland is a manifesto just constantly urging us to live daringly. That would be a rather simple self-help book message. It is more a poem about the likelihood we will fail to do so, and what to think when memory mocks our desire by presenting to us what we chose at the time not to have, and have suffered the lack of ever since, as to quote from the Hyacinth passage. Yet when we came back late from the Hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. Looking into the light, looking into the heart of light, the silence, Odandlir das Meer, bleak and empty the sea, One glance into the heart of light, and we turn back to gazing into the heart of darkness. And originally, Eliot took the heart of the horror as an epitaph for the Wasteland. So having the phrase heart of light is clearly in dialogue with heart of darkness. And so one glance into the heart of light, why do we turn back to gazing into the heart of darkness? Why is it more comforting in a weird way to look into preferring the paved way with all its fundamental falsity to the handful of dust we fear so much beneath the pavement, measuring out our life with coffee spoons, marking our time with what masquerades as accomplishment? As with an internal combustion engine, the point of modern life appears to be keep repeating, this is the bad advice, keep repeating the same dynamic over and over again. We live in the alternating cycle where everything is either a problem or a solution. The moment where an engine questions itself and the moment where it breaks down are the same moment. And then the only answer imaginable is how to fix it, not why it keeps breaking. And it is the pothole that makes us consider the road, depression that threatens routine, anxiety that upends peace of mind. To view disruption as breakdown rather than breakthrough is a regrettable pattern of modern living. But to do so is to build a prison by imagining a key that might unlock it, never considering is our fantasy of the key that builds the reality of the prison, as how Eliot puts it. I have heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison. Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. It's one of his more beautiful paradoxes. You're in prison because you want the comfort of imagining a key that will unlock your life, which puts you in jail. It's the imagining of the key that creates the prison, not that you're in prison and now you have to imagine the key. So stop imagining the answer and live the question. Okay, I have yet more, but I think I think I may pause on that somewhat preacher note and see if I can't turn this back to Barry or Trinity. And I haven't dared to look at the chat while I was talking, so or else I stunned everybody into silence. But any reactions or pushbacks or whatever, I'm happy to respond.
I don't see anything that's been entered into the chat that I can see, but people can feel free to do so. We'll also keep an eye, see if anyone has their, hand raised, and I'll let the two of you go from there.
I guess I'll go ahead and get things started with a question for you, Gary. And first a comment and then a question. The use of Stein's metaphor about the internal combustion engine, I think, has now changed the way I'm going to teach any kind of modernist work. I'm absolutely stealing that. I love that whole framework. But in one of your videos, I think it was a class video you recorded just this year, you talked about this poem and you said that you've been teaching or reading this poem for 30 years and you still don't feel like you've read it. So talk about the way, do you approach the poem differently every time you read it? Do you see the poem differently every time you read it? What prevents you from feeling like you've read it?
I absolutely do. And that's been the joy of teaching literature for me, especially these masterpieces of Godot, The Wasteland, Ulysses, and so on, is that every time I come before the piece, I usually think I'm going to bring my new knowledge or my new experience to bear on the poem, and in every case, I find it's already been waiting for me. That I don't bring anything new to the poem. The poem is in ways always greeting me and saying, "Hi, what took you so long?" And the lines in The Wasteland that I obsess on can change from lecture to lecture and certainly from year to year. The what grows in the stony rubble, as probably Sarah and other students can attest, was a huge clarion call for this piece. But lately I've been talking much more about the jail and the key. And it might be because I'm that much older. And you mentioned, Barry, that the original title of this poem was "He'd Do the Police in Different Voices" from our mutual friend. And it's stunning that he'd ever even imagine calling it that. But it's a really curious scene, as you know, as you probably know, but for the rest of the listeners, that I think it's a woman who's very proud of her son, he reads the newspaper out loud for whoever else is gathered in the room. And the mother is praising him and saying, he does it something lovely. He do the police in different voices. And the fact that Eliot, thought that could be a title, I think is a huge clue that we too should be almost imagining we're eavesdropping on the Wasteland. I don't think you read the Wasteland. I think you sit down next to it at a cafe and overhear it. And it's precisely that kind of looking askance that I think brings the full brilliance of the Wasteland. Instead of turning and focusing and saying, okay, why did he quote from Tristan and Isolde, which I've done, and I have no problem with it. But the beauty and the majesty, it seems to be by looking out of the periphery of your life for the Wasteland. Long answer.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I think Ray had his hand up, and then we've got some comments in the chat that I'll go ahead and read. But Ray,
Cool.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's all good? Yeah. Okay, good. I was messing around with my microphone. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so because I want to turn the conversation away from poetry, but as we're talking about poetry, I'm going to frame my question around narrative, because I'm really interested. So that with the key thing, my immediate thought was about the sort of internal combustion engine versus narrative, and what is, if not the responsibility, what is the relationship between these internal combustions and narrative? I mean, even, is the narrative in the way that I, as someone reading it, this key line, for instance, expect or understand that there should be another turn of the law or turn? So I sort of fill in this gap. Or do we understand like these moments as trying to get us to think critically about narrative? Or I guess just what's the relationship between combustion, progress, and the sort of way that we order these explosions into narrative? And
Yeah, good. I think, it's a fairly almost unavoidable question that in what is narrative a containment strategy? Certainly it can be, and certainly it has been. And curiously, Eliot seemed really anxious to give Joyce some kind of prize for having found a new way to use narrative as a containment strategy. But Joyce, I don't think was doing that. I think Eliot was talking about his own anxiety, which is, as he says in Proofrock, it is impossible to say exactly what I mean. That's actually a line in Proofrock, which my students always seize on and say, why the heck are we reading this? The guy who wrote it doesn't know what he's talking about. And that's the paradox of, and Proofrock is often seen as really the beginning, 1911, of a kind of modern poetry where poets agonize over I have to use words, and words are deceiving and deceptive. And then the novelists come along and say, I've got to use narrative, but narrative is deceiving and deceptive. So, okay, I'm going to throw out plot. I'm not going to give you any plot, but that's not good enough. Then they switch to something that, we've called stream of consciousness. And so I think what Wallace Stevens talked about, something he called necessary fictions. And that to me is what narrative is. It's a fiction, but it's also necessary, which means that it's not just a fiction. And what modernists, and certainly Beckett, what they want to draw attention to is, like the self, narrative is also seductive. You can't even read the current political headlines without seeing how seductive a narrative is, especially I think in modern life, where things are so confusing. That we get really susceptible to anyone, say a part-time president con artist who presents a narrative that people are still lining up for, even though it makes no sense. The truth value of the narrative is irrelevant. What matters, and this is both the strength and the danger of narrative, is how well does it function as a necessary fiction? Joyce's famous epiphany, to go to your point again, Ray, is in a way almost trying to have it both ways. You have a story that gets shattered. So the boy of Araby thinks he knows what he's doing. He's like he's going to bring something to back to Mangan's sister. She hasn't asked for anything. He doesn't have enough money. He doesn't know what it is, but he's perfectly happy to go to the bazaar and get this done. Get what done? He doesn't even know. So it's predictable that he crashes and burns and the lights go out and he doesn't have the president and he's looking up at the sky and he says, I saw myself as a creature derided by vanity. Pretty astute observation for a 10-year-old, which is presumably what he is. But modernists set that up over and over again, but I don't think they're trying to get rid of narrative. I think what they're trying to say is it's necessary and it's a fiction. And if you're feeling hemmed in by your necessities, re-examine your fictions. That's a response anyway.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess, yeah, because the way I was thinking about it in that, I've just been looking at that key line, right? I've heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. And you can imagine him say, and it was just the one time it turned. And there was just this one time it turned. And even though you only heard the key turn once, all of a sudden that it progressively keeps happening over and over again. And so the prison is being unable to escape from that sequentialness, and narrative then becomes the way of turning sequentialness into transformation, development,
Yes.
and progress.
And I think
so that the explosions occur whether we like it or not, in the sense that it's internal to us and our way of conceptualizing the world. And the narrative, I guess, yeah, as a containment strategy or a way of understanding these things within a sort of progressive teleology. Well, yeah, that's not.
And by the way, just to widen this briefly, it's amazing to me that Virginia Wilson, Mrs. Dalloway, arguably another cornerstone of modernism, is really set in motion by a car that backfired. Mrs. Dalloway's gone to get the flowers. She's going to have her party. Everything's arranged. And then there's a bang. And of course, Septimus, a World War I vet, gets triggered immediately into thinking he's being bombarded in the trenches. But everybody jumps. And Woolf gives us this moment that everything's ruptured. And then the next 20 pages of the novel, you see everybody trying to get their act back together. Like, as if, because we assume that the purpose of a car is not to backfire, but cars backfire. And to ignore the fact that cars backfire is to buy in too much to the illusion that progress is the reality of the combustion engine or the capitalist economy, or the latest purchase of deodorant, whatever this presumed vehicle of advancement is. I don't know if anyone wants to. I'm happy to read the chat comments, by the way. Does that make sense? Did I moderate that way? And then others can jump in. So, is the use of techniques from one medium to another similar to Stein's writing under the Cézanne? Yeah, and Hemingway too, as you probably know, talked about going and studying Cézanne in particular at the museum, and that. It's interesting when you have a writer go look at paintings, or even the influence of African art on the modernists, where there was no need for identified disciplines anymore. People were looking for frisson. They were looking for friction. They were looking for all the things Stein's talking about: rupture, friction. They knew that everything was about pressure and traction now. It wasn't about logic. And they were trying to understand what are the actual, even Karl Marx rather famously wrote to one of his friends and said, everybody's walking around with 10,000 pounds of pressure on their shoulders per square inch, but does anybody feel it? And it's kind of, Marx's work goes on to try and to further understand that. How do you walk around with 10,000 pounds of pressure on your shoulder and not know it? But we do. And we can, until we break down. And suddenly we collapse on the ground because we're under 10,000 pounds of pressure, even though a week ago we were walking down the street. I think that's one of the most brilliant observations of the modernists, is this idea that be careful, because we have these systems, these apparati that artificially give us the capacity to carry an unbelievable burden. But at some future point, when they slip, we're not going to have a chance to adjust. I mean, that's what a breakdown is, right? And Eliot had one in the middle of writing The Wasteland. He had a panic attack at the bank one day, and he had to go home, and he was terrified to go back to work because he thought it would happen again. And so we went to Margate. So if we're looking for things to thank, how much of we probably wouldn't have The Wasteland if Eliot didn't have a terrible job that gave him a nervous breakdown. Because like any genius artist, Eliot figured out how to take the failures and the ruptures and the breakdowns and realize that they are the access points to human understanding. It's Joyce, Stephen Dedalus actually says at one point in Ulysses, the man of genius makes no mistakes. His errors are the portals to his discoveries. And I think in his own way, and this is what the artist has to do. I'm a failed banker. I'm the worst banker ever, but I'm going to be a poet. So who cares? Or even, I'm glad. Or Kafka working in an insurance company, which I've never been able to get my mind around. And then coming home and writing Metamorphosis after reading accident reports all day. I'll just keep reading because I don't want to ignore anyone who's gone to the trouble of typing a comment. So just a thought, the cracks that are fundamental to the form of the wasteland are also quite literally part of any wasteland. That is what barren, arid land looks like. It's cracked and fissured. I like that comment, Turner. And I think that's something we see again in a lot of modernist art is that in the middle of life, we're also in death. Wallace Stevens will say that death is the mother of beauty, which is kind of counterintuitive. But Stevens' point being is if we didn't have death, then we wouldn't have the beauty of an impermanent rose. I mean, there's a reason you don't give people plastic flowers on Valentine's Day. Nobody likes it because they could even be prettier. But what's the point? You need the ephemerality of mortality to make a rose beautiful, to make a life meaningful. And sure, there's a lot of pain and loss to that, but that's what life is in the sense of the crystal. So anytime you're looking at a beautiful garden, you're also looking at a dried out, cracked patch of land. Every garden is a cracked patch of land too. Every life has mortality. And I think modernity in particular has become very death phobic. So it keeps insisting that there's nothing but a verdant garden. And so we're kind of age phobic too. No one's supposed to get wrinkles, or if we do, we have all these creams. And there's a store, I just went by a store today that was called the Anti-Aging Emporium. And I was like, sounds like the least fun club in the world to join. I mean, it's like, what do you have, video games? Why do you guys, amuse yourselves? So Trina, I think you bring up a really important point. There was a corollary of a point I was trying to make, that Eliot wants us to simultaneously see life and death, lust and love, exploitation and nurturing. They're inextricable. You can't, as Dr. Jekyll found out, you can't isolate Mr. Hyde and then jettison him. So Professor Leonard, in the future, when the internal combustion engine becomes historic, how will modernity address this in the future? It is a snapshot of time. Well, yeah, and Sarah, if this was one of my usual 3-hour classes, I would have fun unpacking this for a while. But I'll have to say rather quickly that clearly the engine of our time is the internet. And if Stein were around, she'd probably agree. Like, if you want to understand contemporary art, we're going to have to understand the internet, because the internet's not a discovery either. The internet is a new way of modeling the modern self-containment strategy for the shocks of modernity. That's why we have the selfie, and we have Facebook, and we have, I don't know how many apps. And these apps are all containment strategies. And these websites are containment strategies saying, we will organize your life. We will, you put your best pictures up here. And then, every morning now, Facebook sends me a photo from, I don't know, 8 years ago. And I look and, I look at it and say, well, that's fine. But I sometimes think, what if that was a really bad day? But Facebook assumes that if I have a really bad day, I'm not going to take a picture of it and upload it. But maybe we should, because that's the problem with containment strategies. They don't encourage us to go down into what Yeats called the rag and bone shop of the heart, where all the ladders start. So I love the idea of this poem having jump cuts. When I was rereading the poem this morning, I kept likening it to warps in time and space. And Tiresias is perhaps the only one who can see all of it and is the hidden connection in the disconnections. A nice comment, Rachel. He is the hidden connection, but it's also the case that he himself is hidden from everybody. And it reminds me of Blake's comment that wisdom is sold in the desolate marketplace where nobody comes to buy. Tiresias has an enormous amount to offer, and nobody could be less interested. Every prophet's despised in their own time. We don't want it. We don't want to hear it. What would he say to this couple? I'm not entirely sure. It's the most meaningless sexual encounter in literature, which is kind of a feat in itself. But absolutely nothing happens. How do two people conduct themselves, at least in the most intimate way physically, and do it in such a way that absolutely nothing has happened? And that seems to be the way that's depicted. And Kathleen, you're right, he was definitely a better poet than a banker. And then Amy says, in many ways, the internet is another great example of perfecting reality too. The Instagram filters, photoshopping more generally, but the filters are really apparently a really quick way to do it. And there was a science fiction movie called Surrogates, which pointed out that if you keep posting images of yourself that never age, and one thinks of Dorian Gray, after a while you're ashamed to leave the house. COVID, I imagine, has done its own. There's some artist who has an exhibit in New York about pictures. She's a photographer, and she just took pictures of women what they decided to do with COVID. Did they let their hair go gray or not? And took pictures of women in various degrees of having been sort of cut off from a socialized way of image upkeep. But what's scary about the filters and stuff is your hair can be any color you want for as long as you want. Until you don't recognize yourself, and no one else would either, if you were to go live. I don't know what my students are going to think when I'm back in the classroom, having stared at me on Zoom for a year. But presumably, I want to keep aging so that I both recognize myself and can be recognized. But our culture doesn't make it easy, because it tends to persuade us so much of how much better we'd feel if we were recognized in a manner that we're not, which how is that going to work out? Because even if people, when I'm at parties or whatever, and people, it's been a while, people come up and say, "You look great." I'm always kind of like, "Why are you so surprised?" And how I don't know how to start a conversation from that point. Like, my degree of decay is less than you thought. I mean, it's just not much of a conversation. So I think I got to the end of this, the comments. Any other jump-ins out there?
There was one question from Nirmal on the thread. He says, "I'm still reading Ulysses for the first time for class, so do forgive any lack of deeper understanding, but would you contrast the fascination of Minutiae and Joyce with the discontinuity in Wasteland that you mentioned?
No, that's nice. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Irma. The issue of minutia. We know that it's on Eliot's mind because his most quoted line is, "I measure out my life with coffee spoons." So that tension of how do you mark the passing of your life, which can become so trivialized by the ways we have of containing, the shocks of life. So I think what Joyce starts with Dubliners and certainly continues into Ulysses is the beauty is in the details. I think it was John Lennon said, "Life is what happens while you're making plans," and I feel that's kind of a modernist comment. It's really hard to understand that the moment you're in is the only thing you did have, or will have, because it's not packaged. It's not. So I think this emphasis on minutia and discontinuity and rupture, part of it is, I think, an attempt to remind you to be where you are when you're there. I mean, how many of us are not where we want to be in the moment? But I think of traffic jams that way, the ultimate modern metaphor. I'm stuck on the highway with 5,000 other people who don't want to be there either. Well, what are we all doing? None of us are where we want to go, and all of us are there. So the emphasis, this is my beef about paving roads too, by the way. No matter how many lanes you put, eventually you get a traffic jam. And by that point, you don't know how to go. You don't know how to go to where you want to any other way. You become dependent on the congested highway. So yeah, well, good. Keep going, Nirmal. Good luck. I think you got some nice intuition about what Joyce is up to. So my daughter-in-law would like to point out that Gary is often in his moment, but really in the moment. I was going to argue that my moment is the moment, but I came across my my kindergarten report card the other day, which I'm not going to tell you how many years ago that was, and I read the teacher comments on the back, and I was 5 at the time, and the teacher wrote rather prophetically, Gary likes to talk. He needs to learn to let other children talk too. But clearly I'm still working on that. I got an unsatisfactory in kindergarten, and I really haven't figured out how to up my game, but at least I picked the right profession, right? I mean, if I'm called a professor, there's not a big surprise when I talk a lot.
Yeah, that's what we do. I want to come back to the idea of anxiety, because I think that's so central to this poem, especially at the beginning, because we get Eliot, in creating this poem, he created it from a place of anxiety with his bank job and his marriage and just the world post-World War I, and trying to find a new way to express things. And the anxiety that's expressed in the coming of spring, that it's winter that kept us frozen, winter that kept us from thawing out. And there's this anxiety about spring coming. And I think throughout this poem, there's so much anxiety expressed that is kind of specific to Eliot at the time, but it also becomes universal and it's still relatable to us today. And I think that's why we kind of still go back to this poem and encounter it over and over again. But talk more about the anxiety here.
Sure. Eliot actually, although I don't think he was talking about anxiety at the time, in his famous essay on Hamlet, he made a point, he critiqued Hamlet, which takes a lot of confidence in the first place, but he complained about Hamlet, saying there was not an objective correlative. This became to me at least, it's a really useful phrase, that Hamlet doesn't have a sufficient objective correlative for what he's going through. And I think Eliot's right, but what always amuses me is that he's somehow in his essay writing, not in his poetry, he's missing the fact that Hamlet is the first great example of a modern anxious person. I mean, by definition, of course, Hamlet's going on about things and he doesn't have sufficient cause. That's what Hamlet is. and so he's not Macbeth, and he's kind of an annoying tragic hero in that regard, but he's the cornerstone of modern anxiety. And here I would distinguish between anxiety and fear, because anxiety is fear that has no objective correlative. You're afraid and someone says why, and you can't say, then you're anxious. If you can say why, you're afraid. And anxiety is displaced fear. And one of the most famous moments in the Wasteland is where the one of the voices says, come in under the shade of the red rock, and I will show you something that's not your shadow in the morning or your shadow in the evening. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. And of course, the allusion here would appear to be from dust thou art and to dust thou shalt return, a very prominent biblical quote. So partly what he's saying is, as you do all your pursuits with your shadow behind you, your shadow in front of you, looking like all these men trudging over London Bridge that death has undone, you're afraid. We're a culture that's afraid of death. And if you're afraid of death, you're going to be anxious about everything in a way, because anxiety is trying to disconnect your fear from its object. And if we're taught in a death phobic culture to fear getting older, and there's no question that we're invited to fear getting older, then we can choose anxiety precisely because it dissociates from the objective correlative. So I think Eliot was a brilliant theoretician about anxiety, but he complained about it, which I've always found funny, that his Hamlet's soliloquies bother Eliot. And Eliot, as you know too, is in many ways was the architect of new criticism, in the sense that he said the life of the poet has nothing to do with the poems, which simply isn't true. I mean, you don't have to bring the life of the poet, but to exclude the life of the poet doesn't make sense. I mean, Eliot, said he felt like he had something to hide, because later in life he'd referred to the Wasteland as a personal grouse. And it's like, well, if this is a personal grouse, then can we inquire into your life? What were you grousing about in the Wasteland? It's like Eliot almost opened the door, saying, why don't you read the poem biographically and not epically? But it's quite a feat to turn your own anxieties into, as Shakespeare does with Hamlet. How do you turn your own anxieties into a representation of anxiety that all of us who are also anxious correlate to? Because there's nothing more boring than people complaining about their anxieties in a way that's unrelatable.
Excellent. And Trinity, do we still have time for more questions, or are we running out of time?
We can do a few more if you'd like. Like I said, we can watch the chat, or if anyone wants to raise their hand, I'll keep an eye on that.
Yep. Yeah. Is it Ray? Is that your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to give other people time to think, but I'm sorry, I'm still thinking about narrative, and now I'm thinking about narrative and anxiety, because so I'm trying to figure out what anxiety is, especially in the context of this poem or in the context of Eliot. Is anxiety that sort of the idea of the expectation or dread, and not the thing itself? In fact, anxiety is predicated on the thing itself not being there, or maybe not existing, and maybe the thing not even being defined before the anxiety. That the anxiety is a feeling in search of an object to attach to. And so on the one hand, anxiety could be the motor of a desire to connect, and a desire to make those connections. So we can go back to the key, which apparently that's just the passage I want to keep talking about, right? That he only hears the key turn once, but then the horizon, his prison is the horizon of expectations around the next event, that the event should follow. And that anxiety is a kind of weird formal structure that can never be satisfied, because it always needs to be sort of feeling into an absence that needs to be filled.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it's not really narrative at all. To the extent that narrative begins and ends at some point, it's just appetite. And so, I mean, I guess I think if we want to think of Eliot outside of narrative or as having a sort of critical relationship to narrative, it might be something, maybe anxiety is one of the ways that you could think about it.
Yeah, because I mentioned it in my talk, and I think this is something I'm interested in with Hemingway's prose style too, is can we talk about narrative that has been traumatized? I'll put it that way. Because so many narratives in modernist art that seem to not say what they mean, and they go beyond unreliable narrators. And Hemingway's famous iceberg theory, where he said 9/10 of the story should be beneath the surface. That too seems that can be the feeling of anxiety, that you're only dealing with 1/10 of what you should be dealing with, and you're not sure what the other 9/10 are. And in the case of the Titanic, that didn't work out at all. So there's that concern of the engines, as you say, are driving you full speed ahead. But what if you're not seeing everything that's there? That's another kind of anxiety. Then you could run aground, or you could have an iceberg rip open, half your hull somehow, and that sudden. So we're very unsure that we can see everything that matters anymore, and it can lead to a kind of fearful hesitancy as well. But I agree with you that the engine, since we talk about engines so much, the engine of anxiety is that the thing that you feel would appease the anxiety is not a thing that you can name, because it doesn't exist. And I was alluding to this earlier, that anxiety is also a motivator. I mean, too much anxiety is a breakdown, but no anxiety at all is a lack of motivation. So part of the trick is, I think you nailed it. I think the trick is expectation. That expectation can drive anxiety into a debilitating zone, because now you're not only longing for something that you feel would complete you, were you to get it, but you're also convinced, and this gets back to the key in the jail, that if it doesn't materialize, your life will be tragic and incomplete. And it's not true. It's like you've created that jail. And Beckett was once asked why the character of Lucky, who says nothing the entire play except for one frenzied monologue, they asked Beckett, why did you call him Lucky? And Beckett said, I suppose because he has no more expectations. Yeah. So Robert, let's see what we got. Thank you very much. We are fortunate that you began your craftsmanship of talking at age 5 and then shared it so brilliantly. I will leave more with your questions going forward. I also appreciate Barry, Trinity, and Jean making the series come alive tonight. Wonderful for all of us. Thank you, Rob. And I too should pause and thank Barry and Trinity and the Quinn series. It's really fun opportunity for me to chat with people from so many walks of life. And I tried to keep this talk open-ended so that hopefully you'll leave with questions. I'm going to read this damn poem again, and I'm not going to worry about how little I understand. would also be a good take-home message.
Yeah, and just to let you know, Gary, Rob Huntington as our university president. I appreciate him coming here tonight and joining us.
I certainly do too. Anytime the deans around here support my ramblings, I'm also very grateful.
Absolutely. And I think finally, we have another question from, it looks like Nirmal. He said you were introduced as a Joyce scholar, and he's doing a Ulysses course at university right now, taught by Professor Jibu Matthew, and he wondered if you knew each other.
That's what's the name again? Did he say the name?
Jibu Matthew.
Jibu Matthew. I don't. I mean, it's possible, but no. I'm afraid the name doesn't ring a bell. One thing that's a tragedy to Joyce scholars is we love our Joyce conferences. Barry and Ray, I think, can attest to that. And I've often wanted to write maybe a humorous skit of how much you can tell about how much you're going to enjoy a literature conference based on which writer it is. Like I went to the Conrad conference and that was deadly. And I was like, well, why am I surprised? And then, the Eliot conference is incredibly cerebral, but the Joyce conference is everybody wants to sing and hit the pubs, you know, and they'd have the panels there, and sometimes they do. So they're super fun. So I may have run into your teacher there, but it could have been in a crowded beer hall with everybody shouting their names. So you ask him the same question if he remembers, you know, meeting me.
All right, I think that's all we have. So I guess Trinity, we'll turn it back to you.
Oh, you're muted, Trinity.
Thank you. So if anyone was interested in learning more about John Quinn and you can make it to Tiffin, Ohio, we do have some materials here in our local history collection, and our library staff can help you locate those. As we said, the first event in this series was held in March, and Dr. Ellen Scheibel from Bridgewater State University led a discussion on James Joyce's Dubliners. And if you missed the event, you can view that recording on the John Quinn Lecture Series website. And we will be putting the recording of tonight's event on that website as well. Earlier, Dr. Devine mentioned that the next event in the series will be this fall, and will focus on Quinn and his massive modern art collection. And at the time of his death, John Quinn had the largest collection of modern art in the world, including works by Van Gogh, Monet, Matisse, Gauguin, and over 50 works by Pablo Picasso. So he's still in talks getting the guest speakers ironed out for that event, but we will make an announcement when we have the date for that. And just again, thank you, Dr. Leonard. Thank you to Heidelberg University, the Department of English, and Brooks and Jean Warren Geckler. And Jean is here with us tonight. So thank you for making this possible. You know, as you said, it's so nice to have so many people from all over the world. And I would say this evening, but I know some of you, it's very early in the morning. So thank you all. We hope to see you all at future events, both online and in the library. So
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
And I did put my email down, so if anybody wants to follow up or say hi or whatever, feel free to email me.
Thank you. And I can send that out to in the email with the link to the recording to all the attendees.
Excellent.
And even those who registered and weren't able to make it tonight.
Right.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
My contact information will be at on the John Quinn lecture series website with the recordings. My contact information is there. You can always reach me.
Okay. And great to see you, Ray and Shao. I'm gonna call you on Facebook, but we're not going to talk about Wasteland. Okay. Bye now.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.